You are alone. Nobody is watching you. Nobody is recording. Nobody could possibly care what you are doing right now. And yet, you just changed how you were sitting. Maybe you tidied something up before opening your laptop. Maybe you chose a different word in that message before pressing send. Maybe you reread something you wrote 3 times before deciding it was okay. Nobody asked you to do any of that. No audience was present, no judgment was incoming. And yet, the adjustments happened anyway. Automatic, quiet, almost invisible. This is what it feels like to carry an audience inside your mind. Not a real audience, not people who are actually watching, just the possibility of one. The awareness that somewhere, somehow, at some point, someone could see this. And once that possibility becomes permanent, once it moves from occasional to constant, something begins to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. In the small adjustments. The deleted sentences, the retaken photos, the softened opinions, the carefully worded replies. The version of yourself you present to the world starts requiring a little more maintenance than you ever expected. And somewhere along the way, without deciding to, without even noticing it, you stopped simply living your life and started performing it. There was a time when most moments simply disappeared. You said something awkward, you changed your mind, you tried a different version of yourself, and then life moved on. The moment passed, the memory faded. There was freedom in that, freedom to experiment, freedom to be imperfect, freedom to exist without constantly leaving evidence behind. Today, that freedom feels different. Before posting a photo, you pause. Before sharing an opinion, you hesitate. Before sending a message, you reread it. Not because the action matters that much, but because someone might see it. And once that awareness enters, once the invisible audience takes its seat, behavior begins to change. The audience is not necessarily real. Most of the time you have no idea who is actually watching. Yet the human mind responds to possibilities almost as strongly as realities. And that is where the anxiety begins. Not with judgment, not with rejection, with awareness. The simple, quiet, relentless awareness that you are no longer existing entirely in private. Here is where it gets interesting, because self-consciousness rarely feels like self-consciousness. It feels like preparation, like caution, like common sense. A person writes a message, then deletes it, writes it again, reads it twice, then presses send. Not because the message was wrong, but because they imagined how it might be received. Someone writes a post, changes the tone, changes the wording, removes a sentence. Not because the original was dishonest, but because the imagined audience had already entered the room. This is one of the most significant shifts created by online life. The interaction no longer begins when other people arrive. The interaction begins long before that. The audience appears first, before the comment, before the post, before the message, before anyone has reacted, before anyone has responded, before anyone has even seen a thing. The mind starts imagining reactions, interpretations, judgments, assumptions, and then behavior quietly adapts around those possibilities. Most people don't notice this happening because it has become completely normal. But normal does not mean harmless. Because here is what actually changes when observation becomes permanent. Human beings have always behaved differently when they know they are being watched. Not because they are weak, not because they are insecure, because awareness changes behavior. Imagine walking through an empty room. Most people move naturally. Their attention stays on whatever they are doing. Now place a camera in the corner. Suddenly, something shifts. Posture changes. Movement changes. Awareness changes. The room is identical. Nothing physical has changed. And yet the experience feels completely different. Because observation has entered the room. The internet extended that experience into everyday life. The difference is that the audience no longer arrives occasionally. The audience is potentially present all the time. Not physically, psychologically. And the human brain evolved to pay attention to potential social threats, potential rejection, potential embarrassment, potential exclusion, potential humiliation. It does not wait for those things to happen. It prepares for them. Which means a person does not need actual judgment to change their behavior. the possibility of judgment is often sufficient. That is why people frequently edit themselves before anyone criticizes them, why they silence thoughts before anyone disagrees, why they soften opinions before anyone objects, why they shape expression before anyone responds. The audience becomes internal. The observer moves inside the mind, and once that happens, visibility no longer needs an actual audience to affect behavior. The imagined audience becomes enough. A person starts asking questions they never consciously intended to ask. How will this look? How will this sound? Will this make me appear foolish? Will people understand what I mean? Will people judge me if they don't? The questions arrive automatically, quietly, relentlessly, and every question pulls attention away from direct experience and toward self-evaluation. This is why online visibility affects people even when they are not online, because the audience is no longer confined to the screen. The audience has become psychological. It follows them into conversations, into choices, into ordinary moments, into moments that nobody else may ever witness. And eventually, the person is no longer simply living life while being observed. They begin observing themselves, and that changes everything. There is a version of you that experiences life, and there is a version of you that watches it. For most of human history, those two versions stayed relatively close together. People lived their lives, then occasionally reflected on them. The experience came first, the observation came later. Today, those two processes often happen at the same time. A person visits a beautiful place. Part of them admires the view. Another part imagines how it will appear online. A person shares a meaningful moment with friends. Part of them enjoys it. Another part notices how it looks from the outside. A person watches a sunset. Part of them is present. Another part is already thinking about the photograph, the caption, the story, the audience. None of these behaviors are inherently wrong. That is important to understand. The issue is not the photo. The issue is not the post. The issue is not the sharing. The issue is what happens when observation becomes constant. Because eventually, a subtle shift begins to occur. The moment stops being enough on its own. Life becomes something you are living, and simultaneously, something you are watching yourself live. That changes more than people realize, because attention is limited. Every moment spent observing yourself is a moment not fully spent experiencing yourself. And over time, the balance begins to shift. The experiencing self asks, "What does this feel like? How does this look?" The experiencing self asks, "What does this mean to me?" The observed self asks, "What will this mean to them?" And while both questions have value, they pull attention in very different directions. One moves inward, the other moves outward. One deepens presence, the other deepens awareness of perception. One anchors you inside the experience, the other places you slightly outside it, watching, evaluating, interpreting, managing. And the more this pattern repeats, the easier it becomes to confuse the observed self with the real self. A person begins asking questions like, what kind of person am I online? What impression am I creating? What does this say about me? At first, these questions seem harmless, even practical. But notice what they all have in common. They are not questions about experience. They are questions about perception, questions about presentation, questions about observation. The center of gravity slowly begins to move, away from experience, toward interpretation, away from living, toward monitoring. And once that happens, something strange begins to emerge. Moments become content, experiences become material. Life becomes increasingly difficult to separate from presentation. A beautiful sunset appears. Part of the mind enjoys it. Another part thinks, this would make a good story. A meaningful achievement happens. Part of the mind feels proud. Another part thinks, I should share this. A difficult experience occurs. Part of the mind feels pain. Another part begins deciding how to explain it, or whether to explain it at all. The observed self is always asking the same question. How does this look? The experiencing self asks something entirely different. How does this feel? And perhaps that is the most important distinction in this entire video. Because one question brings you closer to the moment, the other places distance between you and the moment. Neither is completely wrong. But one becomes dangerous when it starts dominating the other. And for many people, that dominance happens so gradually they never notice it. One post, one photo, one audience, one notification, one reaction at a time. Until eventually, the observation becomes habitual. The audience becomes internalized. And the person starts carrying that audience everywhere, even when nobody is watching, even when no camera exists, even when no post will ever be shared. The audience remains, quietly observing, quietly evaluating, quietly waiting. And that may be one of the most significant psychological consequences of modern visibility. Not that people are watched more often, but that people have learned to watch themselves more often, to become both participant and observer, actor and audience, subject and critic at the same time. And while that may seem harmless, it creates a problem that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, because human beings were never meant to constantly evaluate themselves. Eventually, the observation becomes exhausting. Not because life becomes harder, but because every experience now carries a second layer, the layer of self-awareness, the layer of presentation, the layer of perception. And carrying all three at once requires far more energy than most people realize, which is why so many people today feel tired in ways they struggle to explain. Because the exhaustion is not always physical. Sometimes it comes from constantly watching yourself exist. This is where the conversation usually changes, because up to this point, online visibility sounds like a social issue, a technology issue, a communication issue. But for many people, it feels like an energy issue, a strange kind of exhaustion, the kind that is difficult to explain, the kind that remains even after resting, even after sleeping, even after taking a break. Because the exhaustion is not always physical. It is attentional, psychological, invisible. Imagine giving a presentation. Most people feel tired afterward, not because speaking is physically demanding, but because attention has been divided. Part of the mind focuses on the task. Another part monitors performance. How do I sound? Do I look nervous? Am I making sense? What are they thinking? Did that land the way I wanted it to? Self-awareness becomes intense, and intense self-awareness is exhausting. Now imagine carrying a smaller version of that process throughout the entire day. Not during a presentation, not during a speech, not during a job interview, during ordinary life. A message, a photo, a comment, a thought, a reaction, a conversation. Each moment requiring a small amount of self-monitoring, a small amount of evaluation, a small amount of management. Individually, these moments seem insignificant. Collectively, they become heavy. Because the mind was never designed to continuously split its attention between living and observing. Yet that is exactly what many people do now. They experience life, and simultaneously evaluate how that experience appears. The process becomes so normal that it often disappears from awareness. But the energy cost remains. A person posts something online, then checks for reactions. Not once, repeatedly. A person sends a message, then wonders how it was interpreted. A person uploads a photo, then revisits it later. Not because anything changed, but because perception still feels uncertain. The interaction ends, yet attention remains attached. Part of the mind keeps monitoring, keeps evaluating, keeps checking, keeps returning. This is one reason why modern visibility often feels more draining than people expect. Because visibility is not simply exposure, it is maintenance. And maintenance is endless. A garden requires maintenance. A house requires maintenance. A reputation requires maintenance. An image requires maintenance. And once people begin treating identity itself as something that must constantly be maintained, exhaustion becomes almost inevitable. You can see this clearly in the idea of personal branding, a phrase that would have sounded strange not very long ago. The idea that a person should think of themselves as a brand, a presentation, a carefully managed identity. For some people, that pressure is understandable. Creators, entrepreneurs, public figures. Their visibility is often tied directly to their work. But increasingly, the mindset extends far beyond professional life. Ordinary people begin asking similar questions. How do I appear? What impression am I creating? How am I perceived? What does this say about me? The questions become constant. And while none of them seem particularly harmful on their own, together they create a subtle psychological burden. Because a brand is something you manage, a reputation is something you protect, an image is something you maintain. But a human being was never meant to function like a marketing campaign. Human beings are inconsistent, contradictory, messy, changing. They make mistakes, change opinions, experiment with identities, grow into new versions of themselves. The problem is that observation often rewards consistency, while real life requires change. And so people begin feeling pressure to remain recognizable, predictable, understandable, coherent, to become a stable character in the minds of other people, even when they no longer feel like that person themselves. The result is a peculiar kind of fatigue, the fatigue of carrying an image, the fatigue of maintaining a version of yourself, the fatigue of wondering how every action fits into the larger story people may have about you. And perhaps that is why so many people describe a strange sense of relief when nobody knows who they are. Traveling alone, walking through an unfamiliar city, being surrounded by strangers, entering places where no reputation exists, no expectations exist, no audience exists. For a brief moment, the performance relaxes. The image becomes irrelevant. The observer quiets down, and something else reappears. Presence. The simple experience of existing without management, without presentation, without evaluation, without needing to explain yourself. Many people describe these moments as freedom, not because they gained something, but because they temporarily stopped carrying something. The weight of observation, the weight of perception, the weight of being seen, and that realization points towards something important. The exhaustion is not always coming from life itself. Often, it comes from the constant awareness of life, the constant monitoring, the constant evaluation, the constant question running quietly beneath the surface. How am I being perceived? Because every time that question appears, attention moves away from experience and toward performance. And beneath all of that exhaustion lies a deeper fear, a fear that observation alone cannot explain. Because the real anxiety isn't simply that people are watching. The real anxiety is what people might decide after they do. At first glance, it seems like the discomfort comes from being watched. But if that were true, visibility would always feel uncomfortable. And it doesn't. People enjoy being seen when they feel safe. They enjoy being noticed by people who care about them. They enjoy sharing moments with friends. They enjoy recognition when it feels genuine. So the problem cannot simply be observation itself. The problem lies deeper. The anxiety begins when observation becomes judgment, when visibility becomes evaluation, when being seen starts feeling like being measured. Because beneath the discomfort of online visibility sits a collection of fears that are far older than the internet, older than smartphones, older than social media, older than the technology that seems to trigger them. The fear of rejection, the fear of exclusion, the fear of embarrassment, the fear of misunderstanding, the fear of becoming the person others decide not to accept. These fears are ancient. For most of human history, belonging was not merely emotional, it was survival. Being accepted by the group mattered. Being trusted mattered. Being included mattered. To be rejected by your community could carry real consequences. And while modern life has changed dramatically, the emotional systems inside the human brain remain surprisingly similar. Part of the mind still treats social rejection as something deeply important. Part of the mind still reacts to exclusion as a threat. Part of the mind still scans constantly for signs of acceptance and rejection. Not because it is irrational, because it evolved that way. The internet did not create these fears. It amplified them. It expanded them. It gave them access to audiences previous generations could never have imagined. A person shares an opinion. A few strangers disagree. Objectively, very little has happened. No relationship has ended. No real danger exists. Nothing in the physical world has fundamentally changed. Yet the emotional response can feel surprisingly intense. Why? Because the brain is not responding to pixels on a screen. It is responding to social signals. Signals of approval, disapproval, acceptance, rejection. And social signals have always mattered to human beings.
This helps explain something many people find confusing: why criticism from strangers can feel so personal, why negative comments linger longer than positive ones, why one harsh reaction can outweigh 100 supportive responses. The answer is not weakness. The answer is attention.
The human mind pays extraordinary attention to potential threats, especially social threats. If 100 people applaud and one person rejects you, the rejection often becomes the focus. Not because it is more important, because it feels more dangerous. The mind becomes alert, protective, vigilant, and once vigilance enters the picture, self-consciousness grows stronger. A person starts filtering themselves, not after rejection, before it. They soften opinions, hide preferences, avoid disagreement, suppress parts of themselves, not because they lack confidence, but because anticipation has become stronger than experience. They begin protecting themselves from outcomes that have not even happened. The possibility becomes enough. And this is where online visibility becomes psychologically complicated, because the audience is often invisible, unpredictable, unknown, and the unknown tends to invite imagination. A message is left unread. What does it mean? Someone unfollows you. What does it mean? A post receives less engagement. What does it mean? A comment receives no response. What does it mean? Most of the time, the answer is simple. Nothing significant. People are busy, distracted, occupied with their own lives. But uncertainty rarely feels simple, because the human mind tends to fill empty spaces with stories, and those stories often reveal our fears. One person thinks, they're probably busy. Another thinks, maybe they're upset. A third thinks, maybe I did something wrong. The same event, different interpretations, because people rarely react to reality alone. They react to what reality appears to mean. And that brings us to the deepest layer of this entire anxiety. The real fear is not being watched. The real fear is not even being judged. The real fear is what judgment appears to say about who you are. A negative reaction becomes more than a reaction. It becomes a statement, a reflection, a verdict. At least, that's how it feels. Suddenly, the mind is no longer asking, do they like this post? It starts asking, do they like me? It is no longer asking, do they disagree with this opinion? It starts asking, am I unacceptable? The line between action and identity begins to blur, and once that happens, visibility becomes emotionally expensive. Because every reaction feels personal, every response feels meaningful, every silence feels significant. The audience gains power, not because they actually possess it, but because the mind gives it to them. The opinions of strangers begin influencing self-perception. The reactions of others begin shaping identity. The observer becomes the judge, and slowly, the judge moves inside. This is why many people feel anxious even when nobody is actively criticizing them, because the fear is no longer external. It has become internal. The audience exists inside the mind. The judgment exists inside the mind. The observation exists inside the mind. And once that happens, a person can feel watched even when they are completely alone. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the audience now lives inside the mind, if observation has become habitual, if visibility has become permanent, then what does freedom actually look like? Because perhaps the goal was never to disappear. Perhaps the goal was never to become invisible. Perhaps the answer is something else entirely. The obvious solution would seem to be invisibility. Log off, delete everything, stop posting, stop sharing, disappear. And for some people, that may offer temporary relief. But invisibility is not the real answer, because the problem was never visibility itself. The problem began when visibility changed the relationship people had with themselves, when observation stopped being external and became internal, when the audience moved inside. Think about how often people see themselves through someone else's eyes, not literally, psychologically. A person shares an idea and immediately imagines how it sounds. A person posts a photo and immediately imagines how it will be judged. A person expresses an opinion and immediately begins evaluating how it was received. The moment arrives, and almost instantly, attention leaves the experience and moves toward perception, toward interpretation, toward the audience. Over time, this becomes a habit, a deeply practiced habit. The habit of observing yourself, the habit of evaluating yourself, the habit of seeing yourself from the outside. And eventually, something strange happens. You stop needing an audience because you become the audience. You become the observer, the person constantly watching yourself, monitoring yourself, interpreting yourself, judging yourself. The audience is no longer on the screen. The audience is in your head. And perhaps that is the hidden cost of online life. Not that people became visible, not that people shared more, not that people connected more, but that many people forgot how to stop watching themselves, forgot how to simply experience a moment without turning it into a reflection, forgot how to enjoy something without evaluating it, forgot how to exist without imagining an audience. Because some of the most meaningful experiences in life are almost impossible to perform. A deep conversation, a moment of grief, a private joke, a quiet walk, a feeling that never becomes a caption, a memory that belongs only to the people who lived it. These experiences often feel meaningful for a very simple reason. They are not being observed, not being measured, not being evaluated. They exist for their own sake, and perhaps that points towards something important. Maybe freedom is not the absence of visibility. Maybe freedom is the absence of self-surveillance. The ability to experience a moment without immediately stepping outside of it. The ability to express yourself without constantly anticipating judgment. The ability to exist without continuously managing perception. Not because perception stops mattering, but because it stops becoming the center of your attention. Because the more attention you give the audience, the less attention remains for your actual life. And life is happening in the present, not in the imagined reactions of strangers, not in future interpretations, not in hypothetical judgments. Here, now, in the experience itself. Perhaps that is why peace feels so rare today. Not because people are surrounded by too many voices, but because those voices eventually become internal. The audience follows them home, into conversations, into relationships, into ordinary moments, into silence. And when silence is no longer silent, rest becomes difficult, presence becomes difficult, freedom becomes difficult. But awareness changes things. The moment you recognize the audience, you can begin questioning it. The moment you notice the observer, you can stop automatically obeying it. The moment you realize you are seeing yourself through imagined eyes, you can return to your own. Because not every moment needs to be shared. Not every thought needs to be evaluated. Not every experience needs to become content. Some things were meant to be lived, not displayed. Some moments were meant to belong to you, not the audience. And perhaps the most quietly rebellious thing a person can do in an age of constant visibility is surprisingly simple. To stop performing for a moment, to stop monitoring for a moment, to stop imagining the audience for a moment, and remember what it feels like to be fully present inside your own life again. Because the opposite of visibility was never invisibility. The opposite of visibility is freedom. If this video made you see something in yourself, consider subscribing to Unsaid. And if you've ever felt the quiet pressure of an invisible audience, leave a comment below. I'd like to hear your experience.